Look at this. Is this okay for you? If you think this is okay, then you can leave this video because it's not really going to be up your alley. If you don't, if you think this is a problem, then you can stay because we're going to be talking about this. How has the Covenant system gone in the first couple of months? We're going to be looking over multiple videos at all the Covenant and all the abilities for all the Covenants. But more importantly, we have to start with the main point, which is people's skepticism about this system. Remember, when the first details, the first mentions and comments and interviews from Jonas Kostas were talking about this system, people started raising their eyebrows at the mention that Covenant would have been a major choice of the expansion. You would have had to essentially become a very loyal member of that Covenant, locking yourself out of the other options. Mentions about how it would have been really hard to respec away from the Covenants, how you shouldn't have seen the Covenant as just another talent system, but more so something like a racial ability, something that was a little bit more permanent. Some hope was left in between, mentioning that yes, it is kind of possible to respec if you want to, but it was made clear since the start that it would have taken some grind, it would have taken some time for you to respec from one Covenant to the other. So people weren't very positive about this system because they see 48 different spells added into the game, 4 per class, and then they see that the possible variety, the diversity of the specs were being essentially limited by the Covenant itself. So people started, of course, overreacting and coming out with some extreme examples like everyone is going to level 4 different mages because they're going to play 1 mage per Covenant and just end up playing the strongest one for each type of content and similar things. Now, if I want to play Mythic Plus, I'm going to be excluded from raids because I chose the Mythic Plus Covenant instead of the Raid Covenant, right? Well, you can tell that it didn't really go as bad as it was predicted because we haven't really seen much complaining about this. We haven't really seen much of a push from the community about this system. Many classes being annoyed at the fact that they're being gated from one type of content to the next because they have chosen the wrong Covenant. Let's just say it's not as been as terrible as it was expected. There are, of course, some classes which do have legitimate choices between Covenants that are viable in different types of content. You see, for example, Demon Hunters. You have Havoc and you have Vengeance. You have Paladin. Paladin has Ashen Hallow and it has Divine Toll. They are both very relevant and, choosable, viable for the type of content you want to play. You have Warriors. Warriors have Spear of Bastion in Mythic Plus, and then they have Condemn in Raids. So you do have quite a few of the classes that would benefit from being able to choose their Covenant ability like if it was a talent. But of course, the reason why we haven't seen so many people complain about this is because many more of the classes, many more of the specs are perfectly fine with just a single Covenant for all purpose. You see, of course, Convoke the Spirits for Druids, you see Wild Spirits for Hunters, you see Shifting Power for Mages, even Primordial Wave for Elemental and Restoration Shamans. You have most monks going for Kyrian, and then pretty much all Unholy and Frost DKs going Abomination Limb and Blood DK going Swarming Mist. So they do have some very clear defined Covenant that are the best for their class or their spec, and they're fine with it. But when we go and look at each of the Covenants, we have to start, of course, with the Black Sheep, the one shown at the start to be easily the lowest represented of all Covenants, which is Necrolords. Necrolords are falling at pretty much half the representation of Kyrian and Nightfae, and they're still some 30% behind Ventier as well. The particular situation of the Necrolord Covenant and why it is so low in representation compared to the other Covenants is that many of the other Covenants, while not being the best for a particular class and a particular spec, sometimes are the second best, sometimes are the second or third best, which is still going to give them some representation. The peculiarity of Necrolords is that outside of the 3 main specs, the 3 main classes playing Necrolord, which are Death Knights, thanks to Unholy DKs and to some degree Frost DKs, Shamans, thanks to Elemental and Restoration, and then Priest, thanks to Shadow and some Holy Priests. The peculiarity, as mentioned, is that every other spec has this Covenant as the 4th Covenant, the bottom one, either the 3rd or 4th, at the very, very bottom. To put things in comparison, there are essentially more Nightfae Druids than there are Monks, Hunters, Druids, Rogues, Warriors, Paladins, Mages, and Demon Hunters of all specs of Necrolord combined. That's how little they're being played, even as a 2nd or 3rd Covenant. Maybe some players more focused on PvP end up choosing Necrolord, maybe some players focusing on Mythic Plus only end up playing Necrolord, and this is just not happening for the Covenant. Excluding, as mentioned, the 3 popular classes, the other classes are not having a good time for Necrolord. When you look at Demon Hunters, our first of the classes, Demon Hunter is basically not picking Necrolord ever, because Fodder to the Flame is very bad. And, you know, the other Covenants have been buffed over time from Elysian Decree to the Hunt, and Fodder to the Flame has been reworked a couple of times, but despite the changes, it still doesn't measure up, particularly against the Kyrian one, Elysian Decree. Not sure how much you can talk about Druids and Adaptive Swarm, because for how cool Adaptive Swarm is, for how many different uses it can have, and how much synergy it can have with the Druid's kit, because it's a hot, and it can also be a dot, which can work in multiple different ways, with multiple different passives, abilities, and even legendaries of the Druid toolkit, it is still simply not on par with Convoke the Spirits. So it also loses pretty much all representation. Another example, which is pretty, confusing, it makes you think that Chakram is not played by hunters. Turns out Wild Spirits is very powerful. What makes you think about this is that Chakram has been nerfed by 50% before the release of this expansion. So what was Blizzard's thought process? I wonder, the developers who came up with this choice, what are they thinking now? When they look at the representation of marksmanship hunters and beast mastery hunters and survival hunters who are simply not picking up this ability that they nerfed by 50%. If there are 500,000 hunters playing Wild Spirits and 31,000 playing Necrolord, and you nerfed that ability by 50%, it's interesting. It's an interesting choice. Deathborn for mages is another ability that ended up dying. You could think that it had a lot of power because, of course, it's a cooldown, it's a strong cooldown, and both Arcane and Fire Mage are very powerful within their cooldown. So you thought, well, maybe if we can pair this together to improve our burst, it's going to be even stronger, it's going to make our burst even stronger. But in the end, when you're looking at this from a single target perspective, this is just a 10% spell damage increase on a 3-minute cooldown. It is very long, and you can take something like Shifting Power, which can simply reduce your stronger cooldown, your big cooldown that you would have wanted to pair this Deathborn Covenant ability with, and be much more effective. And also make your specs smoother to play, simpler to play, in the sense that your cooldowns get reduced, you get to use them more often, and you're not tied by such a long cooldown. Nowadays, a Fire Mage has a 1-minute cooldown on its combustion, thanks to Kindling and Shifting Power. This Deathborn is a 3-minute cooldown. It is pretty clunky to be used by mages right now. Then you have another spec like Monk. Bone Dust Brew looked to be decent, particularly for Brewmasters, because back then people were still worried about the lack of Brewmaster Monk's damage. So this ability would have given them some nice, smoother damage done overall. However, Blizzard just removed this problem by buffing the base damage of Monk's abilities plus buffing the legendary damage of the Monk, making this Covenant choice even less useful on Monks, on Brewmasters particularly. And then you move on to another example of questioning balancing, because you look at Paladin. So Paladin is one of the lowest of all Necrolords. There is basically one Necrolord Paladin for every 25 Kyrian Paladins. The question for the Paladins is that Vanquisher's Hammer, which is the Covenant for Paladin Necrolords, has been buffed by almost twice as much damage. It started out as 80% of your spell power or attack power damage, and it was buffed all the way up to 136%. And this is the result despite all of that buffing. Again, clearly this was a very bad choice since the beta. We all know that Paladin is very powerful within its cooldowns. The strength of Paladin, even the synergy amongst its talents, has been around empowering short bursts of damage. And this ability just didn't do anything. It's a 30-second ability which can be good inside of burst, but when you put it in the same option category as Ashen Hallow or Divine Toll, it loses all of its power, all of its options. And then we continue down the nerfing line because we have Serrated Bone Spike. If you haven't played or followed the beta, Subtlety Rogues with Serrated Bone Spike were doing, let's just say, lots of damage as an understatement. Then Serrated Bone Spike was fixed. The damage was essentially reduced by a third of what it used to do. Now, this is sort of understandable because this was also a PvP problem, not just a PvE problem. But then again, PvP problem or not, this has made the ability also very, very less represented for rogues. And then you have another ability that was nerfed, Decimating Bolt. The damage increase started out at 250%, and then over time it was nerfed all the way down to 100%. To be fair, in case of Warlock, this isn't even that bad of an option. It's more that all of the options of Warlock are not particularly good. They're not particularly strong. They are kind of in a similar situation of Rogue, where they don't really have any real standout Covenant ability. But even within the not so standout abilities, this is still the weakest one. And lastly, you had the Cuckshed option, you had Conqueror's Banner for warriors. Basically, forgo all of your personal power, give in to being selfless, and just use an ability that's good for your party or for your raid. Obviously, and unsurprisingly, nobody is picking this. Nobody wants to be a team player. There are even more Night Fae warriors than there are Necrolord warriors. And you don't even know what Night Fae warriors do because you haven't even seen one yourself. So imagine how few Necrolord warriors there are, which are played even less than Night Fae warriors. I think that overall, Necrolord is deservedly the least played Covenant because it is actually just the worst one. I know this might shock you, but people are going to be playing an ability because it's the best. There is a decent subset of players which are going to choose a Covenant because they want to RP, because they want to have the Covenant set and look cool and whatnot, but the vast majority of the players which are going to be performance driven are going to pick the strongest one. You know, if Sims, before the release of the game, told you that Ravenous Frenzy for Ventir was stronger for Druids than Convoke the Spirits, then Druids would have all flocked to Ventir. It doesn't matter if Convoke the Spirits looks cool, you know, it's very thematic and it's nice to look at, whereas Ravenous Frenzy is nothing. You get some red swirlies around you, and that's it. It's awful. People would have still played it because it's the strongest. So you have two problems for Necrolords. Number one, the abilities, most of them nerfed, are just too weak to be chosen. And number two, a lot of their abilities are just boring. They're just not fun. They're just not entertaining. Death Knight, for example, is using Abomination Limb, which is one of the few Necrolord abilities which was buffed. Pretty sure that was Blizzard caving into the pressure, because before the release, Death's Due and essentially Night Fae Covenant was the strongest one for all Death Knight specs, which would have meant Death Knights becoming fairies. So Blizzard decided to nerf that ability and buff the more thematic Death Knight choice, which was Necrolord. And even then, it's a pretty boring and uninspiring ability. The one with some flavor is Shaman and Primordial Wave, which is very technical, niche, hipster. Is not a one-button mega DPS like Wild Spirits and Convoke the Spirits, but at least it's pretty flavorful. But many of the other abilities are just poor. You know, the Hunter's Death Chakram, one button every 30 seconds for some more damage, is just boring. The Paladin, Vanquisher's Hammer, same thing. Every 30 seconds you get an extra finisher. It's not very inspired, on top of not doing the damage or the healing it's supposed to be doing to be on par with the other Covenants. And to me, the bigger problem, even more so than just not having flavor of the month specs. I don't think this is the main issue. I don't mind not having, 600,000 rogues all playing Necrolord because Necrolord has a super OP ability. The bigger problem is it's not even a second option for most classes. For most classes, actually, it's not even the third option. Because you could be in a situation where Necrolord, or any other Covenant that was the least played, doesn't have a single flavor of the month spec, a single super popular spec which chooses Necrolord, but has enough balanced abilities, enough viable abilities that several specs are going to be choosing this Covenant as their second pick, meaning their overall representation becomes much more healthy. Take, for example, Hunters. As I mentioned, all Hunters are playing Night Fae, right? True. There is 500,000 of them, but there is also 130,000 playing Kyrian. How about Rogues? I said that Rogue Covenant abilities are not very inspiring, not very powerful. Still, despite not being powerful, 160,000 and 130,000 are playing Night Fae and Kyrian, and only 30,000 are playing Necrolord. What about things like PvP-only characters, or Mythic Plus, or Raid-only characters, We mentioned Kyrian being very popular for Demon Hunter because of Elysian Decree, but there is also 80,000 playing Night Fae because of the Hunt, and 120,000 playing Ventir because of Sinful Brand. How many are playing Necrolord? 10,000. You see, that's what I mean. Necrolord didn't even need to be in a position to have many flavor of the month specs, it just needed to have more balance amongst all of the Covenant abilities to make them just a bit more viable. Not even the best. I think this is the current situation for Necrolord. Too many abilities have gotten nerfed before the release, and when you look at the current situation, the current performance, it's actually it is, kind of worrying that so many of these abilities have gotten nerfed when you look at the actual popularity of other Covenants, especially because, yes, it's easy to talk with hindsight 2020. It's easy to say, well, dude, I was playing the beta and I knew from the beta that Wild Spirits was OP, that Convoke the Spirits was OP, that Condemn for Warriors would have been their go-to pick, or that Elysian Decree for Demon Hunters, for at least Vengeance Demon Hunters, would have been the pick, and that Divine Toll would have been the far and away most used pick for Paladins. It's easy. But still, when you look at the more underground picks, you know, the more hipster picks, the more forgotten picks, and you start looking at the changes and you see that many of those picks were nerfed by 50%, by 80%, and they are still completely forgotten. Or you see even other picks, like I mentioned, Vanquisher's Hammer, which got buffed by almost twice as much damage, and they are still completely forgotten. It does show you just how out of balance some of these abilities were. So I'm curious what is going to happen in 9.1. We will go over this in the next videos about Ventier, Nightfare, and Kyrian, because as you know, Blizzard is going to be quite reticent in changing Covenant abilities, right? Because of course, they are the ones who wanted Covenant choices to be permanent, to be very crucial picks to the identity of your character. But now that we have gone 2 months into the expansion, we have gotten basically a very solidly shaped meta for Mythic Plus, for raids, and even for PvP. It is clear that some of these abilities require changing, without even saying that they need to nerf the best, because this is going to trigger the Flavor of the Month players, without even saying they need to nerf Convoke the Spirits and Elysian Decree and Wild Spirits. They do need, though, to buff the terrible ones, which would still fall in the category of balancing Covenant abilities, which is not something that people thought would have happened. I still think they will, eventually. They can't just keep so many of these abilities completely in disarray, in ruins, abandoned for an entire expansion. As I mentioned, they developed 48 different abilities. They can't just abandon 35 of them 2 months into the expansion. I think they will have to do something about it. We will see eventually. BlizzCon draws near. We will get some more new information about the upcoming patch. But for now, we will stop at Necrolords. In the upcoming days, we will go for Ventier as the follow-up ones, the second least played of all Covenants, and then we will continue to go up from there until we will end with Nightfare as the last video. Of course, spoiler, the Nightfare video will just be a legendary 30-minute rant about the abomination of that Covenant, so you have been warned. And now we call it quits. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I will keep lobbying for nerfing Nightfare, by the way.